This is my true story. My son threw his dirty shoes at me in front of his wife and told me to clean them properly this time. He said he wanted them polished until he could see his face so he could see what success looks like. Then he smiled that cruel smile while his wife giggled at me on my knees. I had raised him alone and given him everything I had, but he treated me like his personal servant in the house I helped him buy. What he did not know was his bank account with $2 million was actually a joint account with my name on it. But you won't believe what I did next. Before I tell you what happened, tell us where you are watching from and subscribe. I raised my son completely alone after his mother abandoned us when he was only 3 years old. She left one morning while I was at work and took nothing but her clothes and her car. She left a note saying she was not cut out for motherhood and that she needed to live her own life without the burden of a husband and child. I came home that evening expecting to find her making dinner, and instead I found my son crying in his crib and a note on the kitchen table. She never called or wrote or tried to see him again. It was just the two of us from that day forward. I worked double shifts at the factory to make enough money to support us and give him opportunities I never had growing up. I would work from 6 in the morning until 2 in the afternoon, and then I would pick him up from daycare and spend a few hours with him before going back to work the night shift from 10 until 6 the next morning. I barely slept, and I was exhausted all the time, but I did it because I wanted him to have a better life than mine. I wanted him to go to good schools and have nice things and never feel like he was missing out because he only had one parent. I paid for private tutors when he struggled with math and science. I signed him up for summer camps and sports teams and music lessons. I bought him new clothes and a computer and everything he needed for school. I saved money for years to send him to college, and I paid his tuition in full so he would not have to take out student loans. Every dollar I earned went toward his future and his happiness. I wore the same clothes until they fell apart, and I drove the same old car for 15 years, and I never bought anything for myself that was not absolutely necessary. I sacrificed my health working those brutal hours year after year. My back started hurting from the factory work, and my knees gave me constant pain. I developed high blood pressure and heart problems from the stress and lack of sleep. But I kept working because my son needed me, and I would do anything for him. I attended every parent-teacher conference and every school event. I helped him with his homework, even when I was so tired I could barely keep my eyes open. I was both father and mother to him, and I tried my best to fill both roles. I poured everything I had into raising him, believing that love and hard work and sacrifice would create a good man who appreciated what he had been given. I taught him right from wrong, and I taught him to be respectful and kind. I taught him the value of hard work by showing him how hard I worked for our family. I thought I was building a foundation of gratitude and love that would last his whole life. I thought when he grew up and became successful, he would remember everything I did for him and treat me with the respect and love I deserved. I watched him graduate from college with honors, and I cried tears of joy knowing all my sacrifices had been worth it. I watched him get a good job and start making money and building a career. I watched him buy expensive clothes and a nice car and eventually a big house. I felt so proud of him and proud of myself for raising such a successful son. I thought all those years of working myself into the ground had paid off, and that he would be grateful for the opportunities I gave him. But success changed him in ways I never expected. The more money he made, the more distant he became. The bigger his house got, the smaller he made me feel. The more expensive his lifestyle became, the more he looked down on me for being poor and old and no longer useful. I watched the sweet boy I raised turn into someone I barely recognized. Someone cruel and cold who seemed to enjoy making me suffer. I kept loving him desperately, hoping he would come back to himself and remember who I was and what I had done for him. But he never did. The humiliation started small with comments and attitudes I tried to ignore. He would mock my old clothes at family dinners, pointing out how worn my shoes were or how outdated my jacket looked. He would make jokes about how I dressed like I was still living in the past, and his wife would laugh along with him. I would sit there feeling embarrassed and small, but I would force a smile and pretend it did not bother me. I told myself he was just teasing and that he did not mean to hurt me. He started rolling his eyes whenever I spoke, as if anything I had to say was boring or irrelevant. I would try to join conversations at dinner or offer my opinion on something, and he would visibly sigh and look away like I was wasting everyone's time. He treated my words like background noise from someone who did not matter. When I tried to share stories from when he was young or talk about my work, he would interrupt me and change the subject. He made it clear that my experiences and my thoughts were not worth listening to. Things got worse when he started making me serve his friends and colleagues when they came over. He would host dinner parties and business meetings at his house, and I would have to bring drinks and appetizers to his guests like I was hired help. I would stand there holding a tray while his friends barely acknowledged me except to take a glass or say thank you without looking at my face. My son would introduce me as his father, but then immediately give me tasks to do, so I could not participate in the conversations. I was there to serve, not to socialize. He forced me to eat dinner alone in the kitchen while his guests filled the dining room that I had helped him pay for. When I first moved into his house after losing my apartment, I assumed I would eat meals with the family. But he told me it was inappropriate for me to sit at the table when he had company over. He said his guests would feel uncomfortable if I was there, so I would cook the food and prepare everything, and then I would eat by myself in the kitchen, listening to laughter and conversation from the other room. Even when there were no guests, he made me feel unwelcome at his table. He would criticize the food I cooked, saying it was not seasoned right, or it was overcooked, or it was not what he wanted. His wife would join in making comments about how her mother was a much better cook. They would talk about me like I was not sitting right there. They would discuss whether they should hire a professional chef instead of relying on me to cook meals that were barely acceptable. Each humiliation cut deeper than the last, and I felt myself shrinking smaller and smaller. I stopped trying to join conversations because I knew I would be ignored or mocked. I stopped offering my opinions because nobody wanted to hear them. I started staying in my room as much as possible to avoid being around my son and his wife. But even hiding away did not protect me because he would come find me to give me new tasks or criticize something I had done wrong. I stayed silent through all of it because he was my son and I loved him desperately. I kept thinking he would realize how much he was hurting me and stop. I kept hoping he would remember that I was his father who had sacrificed everything for him. I kept waiting for the sweet boy I raised to come back and treat me with kindness again. But that boy was gone, and in his place was a man who seemed to enjoy watching me crumble under his cruelty. I made excuses for his behavior, telling myself he was stressed from work, or tired, or dealing with things I did not understand. I convinced myself that deep down he still loved me, and that the cruelty was temporary. I told myself that if I just kept being patient and loving and helpful, eventually he would soften and treat me better. I was wrong about all of it. His cruelty was not temporary, it was who he had become, and it was only going to get worse. One morning, I was in the kitchen making breakfast when my son came downstairs dressed for work in an expensive suit. He was running late, and he seemed irritated about something. His wife was still upstairs getting ready, and I was cooking eggs and toast, trying to have his breakfast ready before he left. He poured himself coffee and stood at the counter checking his phone while I plated his food. I set the plate in front of him, and he barely glanced at it before sitting down to eat. He had walked through mud in the driveway, and his designer shoes were filthy. He kicked them off near the kitchen table and called me over. He told me to take his shoes and clean them before he got home from work. I said I would take care of it, and I bent down to pick them up. But instead of handing them to me, he tossed them at my feet so they landed right in front of me with mud splattering onto the floor I had just mopped. I stood there looking down at the muddy shoes on the clean floor, and I felt something dark rising in my chest. He said, "Clean these properly this time, old man, and make sure you polish them until I can see my face." I asked him what he meant by properly this time, and he said the last time I cleaned his shoes, there were still scuff marks, and it was embarrassing. He said he wanted them polished until they looked brand new, and he wanted to be able to see his reflection in the leather. Then he said something that made my blood run cold. He said, "I want to see what success looks like when I look at my shoes." He smiled when he said it, that cold, cruel smile that showed he knew exactly how much his words would hurt. He was telling me that success was him and failure was me. He was telling me that when he looked at his polished shoes, he wanted to see himself and his accomplishments, not his failure of a father who had nothing. His wife came into the kitchen right at that moment, and she saw me standing there with the muddy shoes at my feet and my son smiling. She giggled and said, "Oh honey, you are so bad," and she kissed him on the cheek. She thought it was funny that he was humiliating me. She thought it was entertaining to watch him throw shoes at his elderly father and make cruel comments about success and failure. Neither of them saw me as a human being anymore. I was just something to use and mock and throw things at. Something inside me snapped in that moment like a rusted chain that had been holding too much weight for too long, finally breaking apart. I looked at my son sitting there smiling and eating the breakfast I had made for him in the house I had helped him buy with money I had given him. I looked at his wife giggling at his cruelty like it was charming instead of disgusting. I looked at the muddy shoes on the floor, and I understood with perfect clarity that I was nothing to these people except a servant they could abuse. I picked up the shoes without saying a word, and I carried them to the laundry room. My hands were shaking, and my heart was pounding, and I felt rage coursing through my body like electricity. I had sacrificed my entire life for my son. I had worked myself into the ground to give him opportunities and education and a future. I had loved him with everything I had, and this was how he repaid me. By throwing shoes at me and smiling while he told me he wanted to see success reflected in the leather I polished. I stood in the laundry room holding those expensive shoes, and I remembered something I had forgotten. Years ago, when my son was starting his business, I had opened a joint bank account and put money in it to help him get started. The account had grown substantially as his business succeeded, and I had never removed my name from it. I still had legal access to every penny in that account. My son had no idea I could withdraw the money anytime I wanted. He thought it was his money and his alone. He was wrong. My son lived in luxury, believing he had earned every dollar himself through his intelligence and hard work. He drove expensive cars and wore designer clothes and lived in a house that cost more than most people make in a lifetime. He talked constantly about his success and his investments and his business accomplishments. He acted like he was a self-made man who had built an empire from nothing. He genuinely believed the wealth he enjoyed was entirely the result of his own efforts and had nothing to do with anyone else. What he did not know, and what I had almost forgotten myself, was that his primary business account was actually a joint account I had opened years earlier. When he was 25 and just starting his company, he had no credit and no money and no way to get a business loan. I had taken almost everything I had saved over decades of working, and I opened a bank account in both our names. I deposited $50,000 that I had been saving for my retirement, and I told him he could use it to start his business. The account was set up as a joint account with both our names on all the paperwork. I did it that way because I wanted to help him, but I also wanted to maintain some access in case he got into trouble and needed me to help manage things. I trusted him completely, and I never imagined I would need to use my access to the account. I just thought it was smart to have my name on it legally in case something happened. Over the years, as his business grew and succeeded, that account grew with it. By the time he threw those shoes at my feet, the account held over $2 million. His business had expanded, and he had made smart investments, and the money had multiplied far beyond what either of us had imagined when he was starting out. He thought of it as his account and his money, because he was the one making deposits and managing the investments. He had no idea that legally, I had exactly the same rights to that money as he did. Every penny in that account was as much mine as it was his, according to the bank and the law. I had been too broken and too beaten down to remember I still had that access and that power. For years, I had been living in his house being treated like a servant and feeling worthless and powerless. I had forgotten that I was not actually powerless. I had forgotten that the man who threw shoes at me and smiled while doing it was vulnerable in ways he did not understand. His empire was built on a foundation that had my name on it, and I had the legal right to remove that foundation whenever I chose. The joint account paperwork was in a folder in my room, along with other important documents I had kept over the years. I had never thought about it or looked at it because I never imagined I would need it. But standing there in the laundry room holding his muddy shoes, I remembered that folder and what it contained. I remembered the account number and the bank name and the fact that my signature was on every document. I remembered that I could walk into that bank with my identification and access that account without needing my son's permission or knowledge. He had been careless and arrogant in his assumption that the money was entirely his. He had never bothered to check the account paperwork or review who had legal access. He had assumed that because he made the deposits and managed the investments, that meant he was the only owner. He was wrong, and his ignorance was about to cost him everything. The shoes in my hands suddenly felt different. They were not symbols of my humiliation anymore. They were symbols of his mistake and his underestimation of me. I realized in that moment that I had been too paralyzed by love and desperation to see my options. I had stayed in his house enduring cruelty because I thought I had nowhere else to go and no resources to escape. But I had resources. I had access to $2 million that legally belonged to me as much as it belonged to him. Those shoes hitting the floor had broken something inside me, but they had also woken something up. They had reminded me I was not as powerless as I felt. For 3 years, I had lived in his house feeling like an inmate serving a sentence for the crime of aging and becoming inconvenient. Every day felt the same, with routines and humiliations that ground me down until I barely recognized myself anymore. I woke up early to make breakfast and clean the kitchen. I did laundry and vacuumed and scrubbed bathrooms. I cooked meals and served them and cleaned up afterward. I did yard work and ran errands and completed whatever tasks my son or his wife assigned to me. I lived to serve them, and nothing more. I had my own room, but it felt more like a cell than a bedroom. It was small and plain, with just a bed and a dresser and nothing on the walls. I was not allowed to rearrange furniture or decorate or make it feel like my own space. My son said the house had a certain aesthetic and my room needed to match, so it remained bare and cold and unwelcoming. I would lie in that bed at night staring at the ceiling, feeling like a prisoner counting down days to a release that would never come. I cleaned toilets that my son and his wife used without any appreciation or acknowledgement. I scrubbed floors on my hands and knees, even though my joints ached and my back screamed in pain. I cooked elaborate meals that they would criticize and pick apart. I washed their expensive clothes carefully, following every care instruction, while wearing old rags myself. I maintained their perfect life, while my own life withered away into nothing. The worst part was not the physical labor, but the emotional toll of being treated like I did not matter. My son would walk past me without saying good morning. His wife would leave me lists of tasks without please or thank you. They would have conversations in front of me, as if I was not there. They would make plans and decisions about the house without asking my opinion. I was furniture to them. I was a tool they used and then ignored until they needed me again. I endured all of this because I loved my son so deeply it paralyzed me. Even when he was cruel, I kept hoping he would change. Even when he humiliated me, I kept believing he would remember who I was and what I had done for him. My love for him was so complete and so desperate that it overrode my self-preservation. I cared for him so much, I forgot to care for myself. I put his needs and his comfort above my own dignity and my own happiness, because that is what I had always done since the day he was born. But love has limits, even when it feels limitless. Love can be stretched and tested and strained until it finally breaks. Love can survive a lot of cruelty, but not forever. There comes a point where love is not enough to make you stay in a situation that is destroying you. There comes a moment when survival becomes more important than devotion. For me, that moment came when those muddy shoes hit the floor, and my son smiled and told me he wanted to see success reflected in the leather. Those shoes represented everything wrong with my life. They represented how my son saw me as someone who existed only to serve him and make his life easier. They represented his belief that he was superior and I was inferior. They represented years of accumulated disrespect and cruelty that I had swallowed and endured. But they also represented something else. They represented the final straw. They represented the moment when my love reached its limit and broke. I had been stomped on and diminished and humiliated for 3 years. My dignity had been ground into nothing. My self-worth had been destroyed. My identity as a father who deserved respect had been erased. But those shoes lying in the mud on the clean floor woke something up inside me that had been sleeping. They woke up my anger and my sense of self-preservation and my realization that I deserved better than this. They reminded me that I still had power even if I had forgotten it. And they pushed me to finally use that power to escape. That afternoon, my son left for his office, and his wife left for her spa appointment like they did every week. I was alone in the house for the first time in days. I went to my room and pulled out the folder with all my important documents. I found the joint account paperwork, and I looked at it carefully to make sure I remembered correctly. There it was, in black and white, my name listed as a joint account holder with full access and withdrawal rights. The account number was printed clearly on the top of every page. I got dressed in the nicest clothes I owned, which were still old and worn, but at least clean. I took my identification and the account paperwork, and I walked to the bank branch that was about a mile from my son's house. My hands were shaking and my heart was pounding, but I kept walking. I told myself I was just going to ask questions and see what my options were. I told myself I did not have to do anything drastic, but deep down, I knew exactly what I was going to do. I walked into the bank and approached a teller who smiled at me politely. I handed her my identification and told her I needed to make a transaction on my account. She asked for the account number and I gave it to her. She typed it into her computer and her eyebrows raised slightly when she saw the balance. She asked what kind of transaction I needed to make, and I told her I wanted to transfer the full balance to a new account in my name only. She asked if I was sure, because it was a substantial amount of money to move. I said I was completely sure. She asked if the other account holder knew about this transfer, and I said it was a joint account, and I had every legal right to move the money without notifying anyone. She nodded and said that was correct, but she wanted to make sure I understood what I was doing. I said I understood perfectly, and I wanted to proceed with the transfer immediately. She brought over a manager who verified my identification and reviewed the account paperwork. The manager confirmed that I was listed as a joint account holder with full rights to withdraw or transfer any amount. He said they would need to open a new account for me first, and then process the transfer. I agreed, and we started the paperwork. The whole process took about 15 minutes. 15 minutes to erase my son's empire. 15 minutes to take back everything he had built on the foundation of money I had given him. I watched the computer screen as the teller typed in the transfer amount. $2,000,17. The number seemed impossible. I had never seen that much money in my entire life, let alone had access to it. But it was real, and it was legally mine, and I was taking it. The teller hit enter and the transfer processed instantly. The money moved from the joint account to my new personal account. The joint account balance dropped to zero. My new account balance showed $2 million. The manager printed out confirmation paperwork and handed it to me, along with a temporary debit card for my new account. He said permanent checks and a permanent card would be mailed to whatever address I provided. I gave him a post office box address I had opened that morning, specifically for this purpose. I did not want anything sent to my son's house. The manager shook my hand and welcomed me as a valued customer. The teller smiled and said, "Have a nice day." Neither of them had any idea what I had just done or what it meant. I walked out of that bank feeling lighter than I had felt in years. My son had spent 3 years systematically erasing my dignity and making me feel worthless. I had just spent 15 minutes erasing his financial security and taking back what was mine. He had been cruel because he thought he had all the power. He had been arrogant because he thought I was helpless. He had smiled when he threw those shoes because he thought there was nothing I could do to fight back. He was wrong about everything. I went back to my son's house and packed a single bag with my few belongings. I did not own much because I had arrived at his house years ago with almost nothing, and I had not accumulated anything since. I packed some clothes and my important documents and a few photographs of my son when he was young. I looked around the small bare room that had been my prison for 3 years, and I felt nothing but relief that I would never see it again. I found his expensive designer shoes where I had left them in the laundry room. I had actually cleaned them and polished them exactly the way he demanded. They looked perfect with the leather shining so brightly you could see your reflection in it. I carried them upstairs to his bedroom and I placed them carefully on his pillow. Then I took out a piece of paper and wrote a note that I left next to the shoes. The note said, "Cleaned them myself this time and polished them until I could see my reflection. Enjoy looking at yourself in them because that reflection is all you have left." I walked out the front door of that house and I did not look back. I had called a taxi while I was packing and it was waiting for me at the curb. The driver put my bag in the trunk and I got in the back seat. I told him to take me to the airport. He asked which airline and I said it did not matter, just take me to the main terminal. During the drive, I used my new debit card to book a one-way plane ticket to a city I had never been to before. I chose it randomly from the departures board, just looking for somewhere far away where nobody knew my name or my shame. By the time my son came home from work and went upstairs to change, I was already at the airport going through security. By the time he saw the shoes on his pillow and read my note, I was sitting at a gate waiting to board my flight. By the time he understood what the note meant and checked his bank account on his phone, I was boarding the plane. I imagined his face when he saw the account balance had dropped to 0. I imagined his panic and his rage and his disbelief. I turned off my phone before the plane took off because I knew what was coming. I knew he would call and text and try to reach me the moment he discovered what I had done. I did not want to hear his voice or read his messages. I did not want to give him any opportunity to manipulate me or guilt me or threaten me into giving the money back. I wanted to disappear completely and let him sit with the consequences of how he had treated me. The flight was 3 hours long, and I spent most of it staring out the window, feeling a mixture of emotions I could not fully process. I felt free for the first time in years. I felt powerful after feeling powerless for so long. I felt justified in what I had done because he had driven me to it with his cruelty. But I also felt sad because this was my son, and I had loved him so much, and now our relationship was destroyed beyond repair. I felt grief for the boy he used to be, and anger at the man he had become. When I landed in the new city, I turned my phone back on just long enough to see the flood of messages and missed calls. There were over 50 notifications from my son. I did not read any of them. I blocked his number and deleted his contact information. Then I took out the SIM card from my phone and threw it in a trash can at the airport. I bought a new SIM card with a new number that my son would never know. I was cutting every tie and every connection to my old life. I checked into a cheap hotel near the airport using cash from an ATM withdrawal. I lay on the bed in that anonymous hotel room and I felt like I could finally breathe. I had escaped. I had taken back my power and my dignity. I had left behind the man who threw shoes at me and smiled while doing it. I was free. Even though I had blocked my son's number and thrown away my old SIM card, I was curious about what he was saying. I bought a burner phone the next day and used it to check the voicemails he had left on my old number before I disconnected it. There were dozens of messages, and I listened to them in order. The progression from confusion to rage to panic to desperation was almost satisfying to hear. The first few messages were confused. He said, "Dad, where are you, and why are your things gone, and what is this note supposed to mean?" He sounded irritated, like I had inconvenienced him by leaving. Then came the messages after he checked his bank account. His voice changed completely to pure rage. He screamed that I had stolen from him and that I was a thief and that he would call the police and have me arrested. He said I had no right to take his money and that he would find me and make me pay it back. He called me every name he could think of, and his voice was shaking with fury. He said I had destroyed everything he built and ruined his life. He said I was vindictive and cruel and that he could not believe I would do this to my own son. I almost laughed listening to him call me cruel after 3 years of him throwing insults and shoes at me. I almost laughed at him calling me a thief when he had stolen years of my dignity and self-worth. The irony was so perfect it was almost beautiful. He had taken everything from me that made me feel human, and now I had taken everything from him that made him feel successful. We were even except I had the law on my side, and he did not. The later messages showed he had talked to lawyers, and they had confirmed what I already knew. The account was joint, and I had every legal right to withdraw the money. He could not press charges because I had not committed any crime. The money was as much mine as it was his according to the bank and the law. His lawyers told him he could try to sue me in civil court to get the money back, but it would be expensive and difficult, and he probably would not win. He would have to prove that the joint account had been a mistake, or that I had coerced him somehow, and he could not prove either of those things. His messages became desperate after he talked to the lawyers. He begged me to come back and talk to him. He said we could work this out and figure out a fair arrangement. He said he was sorry for how he treated me, and that he had made mistakes. He promised he would be better and treat me with respect if I would just return the money. His voice was pleading and pathetic, and I felt nothing listening to it. His apologies meant nothing, because they only came after I took his money. If I still had nothing, he would still be throwing shoes at me. He left messages saying his business partners were pulling out because he could not cover his obligations. He said his investments were collapsing because he had leveraged everything, assuming he would have access to that $2 million. He said he was losing everything, and it was my fault. He said I had destroyed him over a simple misunderstanding about some shoes. He actually called it a simple misunderstanding, like 3 years of systematic cruelty could be reduced to that. I listened to every message, and I felt no guilt and no desire to help him. He had called me worthless and useless and a burden. He had made me clean his toilets and serve his guests like hired help. He had thrown muddy shoes at my feet and smiled while telling me he wanted to see success reflected in the leather. He had stripped away my dignity piece by piece until I felt like nothing. Now he was experiencing what it felt like to have everything stripped away, and I had no sympathy for him whatsoever. I deleted all the voicemails and threw the burner phone away. I did not need to hear any more of his desperate attempts to manipulate me into giving back what was legally mine. Over the next few weeks, I learned through mutual acquaintances what was happening to my son after I disappeared with the money. I had not cut off all connections to people from my old life, and some of them reached out to tell me what they were hearing. My son's business had been heavily leveraged based on the assumption that he had $2 million in liquid assets. He had made deals and commitments and investments that required him to have access to that money. When the account suddenly went to zero, everything collapsed like a house of cards. His business partners discovered he could not cover his share of their joint investments. They had put money into various projects based on his assurances that he had the capital to match their contributions. When he could not produce the money, they accused him of fraud and threatened legal action. Some of them pulled out of deals entirely, causing projects to fail. Others demanded he buy out their shares immediately, which he could not do without access to capital. His reputation in the business community was destroyed almost overnight. His personal investments collapsed because he had borrowed against future earnings and leveraged his portfolio, assuming he could cover any shortfalls with the $2 million in his account. When that safety net disappeared, his creditors started calling in debts. He had to sell stocks and properties at a loss just to cover his immediate obligations. Every asset he sold made him weaker and more vulnerable. The empire he thought was solid turned out to be built on debt and assumptions that crumbled the moment I removed the foundation. His lifestyle was completely unsustainable without that money. He had been spending far beyond his actual income because he felt wealthy with $2 million sitting in his account. He had expensive car leases and a mortgage on his big house, and credit cards he used freely, assuming he could always pay them off. When the money vanished, he could not keep up with any of it. The cars were repossessed within a month. The house went into foreclosure proceedings within 2 months. His wife left him faster than I expected. I heard she filed for divorce exactly 6 weeks after I disappeared. She had apparently married him because he was successful and wealthy and could provide her with a comfortable lifestyle. When the money disappeared and the lifestyle crumbled, she wanted nothing to do with him anymore. She told people she had been deceived about his financial situation and that she could not stay with someone who had lost everything. She took whatever assets she could claim in the divorce and moved back to her parents' house. It turned out she had never loved him at all. She had loved his money and his status and the life he could give her. The moment those things disappeared, so did she. My son learned the hard way that relationships built on wealth and status collapse when the wealth disappears. His wife had giggled when he threw shoes at me because she thought his cruelty was a sign of power and confidence. She left him when she realized his cruelty had destroyed the source of his power. His friends disappeared just as quickly as his wife did. The people he had hosted at dinner parties and taken on expensive trips and treated to lavish experiences all vanished when he could not afford that lifestyle anymore. They stopped returning his calls and stopped inviting him to events. He realized too late that they had never been real friends. They had been people who enjoyed the benefits of his wealth and wanted nothing to do with him once the money was gone. Everything he had built was revealed to be hollow and temporary. His business success was built on borrowed money and risky investments. His marriage was built on financial security, not love. His friendships were built on what he could provide, not who he was as a person. When I removed the $2 million that was holding everything together, the entire structure collapsed. He lost his business and his house and his cars and his wife and his friends all within a few months. The man who had smiled while throwing shoes at me and telling me to polish them so he could see success was now left with nothing but his reflection. And that reflection showed him exactly what he had become without the money to hide behind. I live quietly now in a small coastal town far away from my son's city and far away from anyone who knows our history. I found a modest apartment near the beach where I can hear the ocean from my window. The place is simple, but it is mine, and nobody can take it from me or make me earn the right to live here. I wake up every morning and make my own breakfast and eat it at my own table without anyone criticizing the food or telling me I should eat in another room. I spend my days reading and walking on the beach and doing whatever I want without a list of chores or demands from anyone. The $2 million sits safely in my account, giving me comfort and security, and proof that I am not worthless like my son tried to make me believe. I do not live extravagantly because I do not need luxury to be happy. I just need peace and dignity and the freedom to live without fear or humiliation. The money means I never have to depend on anyone again. I never have to endure cruelty because I have nowhere else to go. I never have to accept being treated as less than human because I need a roof over my head. I set up a new life with a new name in a place where nobody knows my past. I told my new neighbors I am a retired factory worker who saved carefully and bought a place by the ocean to enjoy my final years. They accept this story without question and treat me with normal, polite friendliness. Nobody here knows I have $2 million in the bank. Nobody knows I am estranged from my son. Nobody knows about the 3 years I spent as a servant, or the shoes thrown at my feet, or the cruelty that finally pushed me to disappear. My son sends letters to the post office box I set up before I left. The postal service forwards them to my new address, and I burn them without reading them. I can see his handwriting on the envelopes, and I know they contain apologies or threats or attempts to manipulate me into contact. I do not care what they say. His words meant nothing when he had power over me, and they mean even less now that I have escaped. I feed the letters into my fireplace and watch them burn and feel nothing but satisfaction that I never have to hear his voice again. He leaves voicemails on the old phone number that I abandoned. I do not listen to them because I threw away that SIM card and that number is dead to me. Sometimes I wonder if he is still calling or if he has finally given up. I wonder if he understands why I did what I did, or if he still sees himself as the victim. I wonder if he ever thinks about the 3 years he spent breaking me down, or if he has convinced himself that I overreacted to one incident with some shoes. I will never know because I will never speak to him again. I am 75 years old, and I have enough money to live comfortably for whatever years I have left. I have my health and my freedom and my peace. I have an apartment by the ocean, and days filled with simple pleasures that I choose for myself. Nobody tells me what to do or criticizes how I do it. Nobody makes me feel small or worthless or like I exist only to serve them. I am free in every way that matters, and that freedom is worth more than any relationship with a son who destroyed his own father for entertainment. My son wanted me to clean his shoes and smile while I did it. He wanted me to accept his cruelty and be grateful he let me live in his house. He wanted to see success reflected in polished leather while I knelt at his feet. So I cleaned out our joint account of $2 million and vanished from his life completely. He can polish his own shoes now if he can afford new ones. Some stains cannot be polished away, and the stain of what he did to me will follow him forever. I am free and wealthy, and finally done serving people who never loved me. And I sleep soundly every night, knowing I will never be anyone's servant again.